The Ottomans are remembered as great conquerors, sultans who built an empire stretching across 3 continents. But hidden behind their victories was a much darker truth. When warriors fell on the battlefield, their wives were not spared. Some were dragged into captivity, paraded as trophies of war. Others vanished into the golden cages of Ottoman harems, their names erased, their past lives forgotten. They were forced into silence, made to serve, entertain, and even bear the children of the very men who killed their husbands. Many of these women never spoke of what happened. Pregnancies were hidden, shame was buried, and their stories were lost to time. History celebrates the battles and the glory, but the wives of the defeated carried scars that no one wanted to see. This is the forbidden side of the Ottoman Empire, the part of history they never wanted you to know. When people hear the name Ottoman Empire, they think of towering sultans, glittering palaces, and unstoppable armies. From the 14th to the early 20th century, the Ottomans conquered lands stretching from Eastern Europe to North Africa and deep into the Middle East. Their victories are remembered in songs, in chronicles, and in monuments that still stand today. But there is another story, one that rarely finds its way into history books. It is the story of what happened after the battles, when the swords were lowered and the smoke of war had cleared. For every army crushed, there were women left behind. The wives, sisters, and daughters of defeated warriors became silent victims of a system that saw them not as humans, but as spoils of war. The Ottomans were not unique in this practice. Almost every empire of the medieval and early modern world treated women as trophies. But the scale and secrecy of the Ottoman system gave it a particular kind of darkness. At first, these women were often rounded up like cattle. Soldiers would seize them in the aftermath of battle, marching them alongside prisoners of war. For the warriors who survived captivity, chains were their punishment. For their wives, the punishment was even more intimate and far more lasting. Some were sold in open markets, traded like goods to the highest bidder. Others were transported across vast distances, carried toward Istanbul, the heart of the empire, where their fates diverged. The Ottoman court was both magnificent and terrifying. The Sultan's palace shimmered with domes and marble, but behind its walls stood one of the most secretive institutions in history, the harem. The harem was not merely a place of beauty and luxury. It was a political weapon, a carefully controlled system where women were both prized and imprisoned. Captive wives, especially those of defeated warriors, could find themselves entering this world. Imagine a woman taken from her village after watching her husband die in battle. One day she was a wife, the next day a captive, stripped of her identity, dressed in silks she did not choose, and renamed in a language she did not understand. To the outside world, she might appear honored, even elevated by her new role. But behind the curtains of the harem, her voice was silenced. Her sorrow had no outlet. For some, the ordeal was worse. They were forced into relationships that left them with children whose fathers were their captors. These pregnancies were rarely spoken of, for they represented both survival and shame. A woman who returned to her family years later might conceal the truth of her child's origins, choosing silence over rejection. This system was not openly discussed. Official Ottoman records rarely mention the private fates of captured women. Chroniclers wrote of victories, of conquered cities, of treaties signed and broken. They celebrated the Sultan's power, the brilliance of his generals, the glory of Islam spreading across new lands. But they did not write about the tears of the women dragged from their homes, nor the silence of the wives whose husbands had died with swords in hand. Yet whispers of these stories survived. Letters, travelers' accounts, and fragments of oral history speak of women whose lives were shattered and remade in captivity. Some found a strange kind of influence within the harem, rising to positions of power as favorites of the Sultan. Others remained nameless, their suffering hidden in the shadows. The truth is this: the Ottoman victories that dazzled the world came at a cost that was paid not only by men on the battlefield, but by the women who had no choice, no weapons, and no escape. Their voices were silenced, their fates controlled by forces far greater than themselves. And that is where our story begins, not with the warriors who fought and fell, but with the women left behind, whose hidden lives carried the darkest secrets of Ottoman triumph. The clash of swords was over, but for the wives of the defeated warriors, the real battle had just begun. When the Ottomans marched victorious into a city, the warriors were slain, imprisoned, or executed. But the women were treated differently. To the soldiers, they were no longer wives or mothers. They were spoils of war. Some women were dragged through the streets as proof of conquest. Others were locked away, their tears ignored, their dignity stripped. The pain was not only physical but also emotional, knowing that the world they had once known was gone forever. Those deemed valuable, because of their beauty, status, or youth, were selected for transport to Istanbul. The journey itself was torment. Weeks of walking under heavy guard, carrying only fragments of their past lives in memory. At night, their fears whispered louder than the marching drums. They did not know whether they would see home again, or what awaited them at the journey's end. The gates of Istanbul promised both grandeur and dread. Behind them loomed the Sultan's palace, the Topkapi, where marble halls gleamed and golden domes pierced the sky. It was here that many captive women were absorbed into the harem. To outsiders, the harem was imagined as a paradise of beauty, silk, and luxury. But for those forced into it, the truth was harsher. Inside the harem was a world of control. Women were renamed, given new identities, stripped of their past. They were taught obedience, drilled in etiquette, and reminded constantly that their lives no longer belonged to them. They were told they had been elevated, but in reality, they were prisoners in gilded cages. Some women resisted in silence, refusing to let their spirits break. Others tried to adapt, masking their grief with compliance. Yet for many, the deepest wound came not from captivity itself, but from the nights they could not speak of. Nights where they were compelled to share the company of men who had destroyed their former lives. Pregnancies followed, unspoken, hidden behind curtains and silences. Children were born into wealth but carried shadows of violence and shame. Mothers bore their pain quietly, never telling their sons or daughters the truth of their fathers. A few of these wives later found their way back to their families, either ransomed or released. Yet they carried secrets they could never reveal. They smiled through reunions but kept hidden the scars of captivity, the memories of forced intimacy, and the children whose existence blurred the line between survival and betrayal. What makes these stories haunting is not just the cruelty of the system, but the silence that followed. The women did not write their testimonies. They did not leave memoirs. Their stories lived only in hushed whispers, carried forward by rumor and suspicion. History moved on, celebrating victories and empires, while the voices of the women remained buried in shadows. Still, fragments survived. Accounts from travelers and diplomats hinted at the dark undercurrents of the Ottoman harem, tales of women taken from the arms of slain warriors, turned into concubines, and forced into lives they had never chosen. Though historians debate the details, the truth cannot be ignored. For every Ottoman victory, there were women who paid the heaviest price. And it is here that the story rises to its most haunting question. What happened behind those palace doors that the wives of defeated warriors never spoke of, not even decades later? Among the countless forgotten voices, one story survived in fragments, whispered, half-recorded, and never fully acknowledged. It was the story of a warrior's wife taken after a brutal battle on the Balkan frontier. Her husband, a seasoned fighter, fell to the Ottoman blades. She was seized, her hands bound, and dragged away as her home burned behind her. For weeks she marched in silence, the chain on her wrists heavy, her eyes fixed on the ground. Grief kept her alive, but when she reached Istanbul, her fate changed again. She was handed to the palace, renamed, dressed in silks she never asked for, and placed among the women of the harem. At night, she lay awake listening to the muffled sobs of others like her, women who had lost everything but were told to smile, to obey, to become ornaments in a world they despised. One evening her turn came. She was brought before a commander who had overseen her husband's death. She did not scream. She did not beg. But in that silence, something inside her shattered forever. Months later, she carried a secret within her, the child of her captor. To survive, she stayed quiet, never speaking of the nights that had broken her spirit. The child was born in the palace, raised with privilege, never knowing the truth of his origins. The mother kept her silence, her pain locked behind a smile, her heart torn between love for her child and hatred for the man who had forced him into existence. Years later, when she was finally released and returned to her homeland, her family rejoiced, believing she had been spared the worst. But she carried her scars in silence. She never told them what had happened in Istanbul. She never revealed that the boy who clung to her side was not her late husband's son. Her secret died with her, swallowed by the earth, leaving only shadows of truth behind. This was not just her story. It was the story of many, women who returned but never spoke, women who lived but carried wounds no one could see. Their silence was their shield, their survival. But it also became history's silence, erasing them from memory, leaving us only with rumors and fragments. And that silence is the loudest truth of all. What the Ottomans did to the wives of defeated warriors was not written in chronicles, but it lived in the scars, the tears, and the unspoken words of women who never dared to tell their stories. History remembers battles in numbers, the armies deployed, the cities taken, the rulers who rose and fell. But it rarely pauses to ask what those victories meant for the people who had no swords to fight with, no shields to defend themselves. The wives of the defeated warriors became invisible casualties, erased from chronicles, buried beneath silence. Their lives remind us that conquest is not only measured in land or blood, but also in broken homes, stolen identities, and secrets carried to the grave. The Ottomans were not the only empire guilty of such shadows. From the Romans to the Mongols, from medieval crusaders to early modern kings, the suffering of women has always been history's most silenced chapter. Yet, in the Ottoman case, the scale, secrecy, and political weight of the harem system created a uniquely haunting legacy. Behind the splendor of domes and mosaics, behind the glory of sultans and generals, lived women whose tears were never recorded, whose pain never made it into the songs of victory. What makes their stories powerful is not only the tragedy but also the resilience. Many survived, adapting to impossible circumstances. Some found influence, using their positions to protect others. Some returned home, concealing their scars, determined to live again. And in their silence, there is strength too. A refusal to let their oppressors fully define them. For us today, uncovering these stories is more than curiosity. It is justice. To tell of their captivity is to acknowledge their existence, to pull them out of the shadows where history tried to bury them. It is a reminder that behind every triumphal march there are voices unheard. Behind every golden palace, there are chains hidden from view. When we speak of Ottoman victories, we must also remember the women who paid the hidden price. Their suffering may have been silenced in their own lifetimes, but in ours, it becomes a lesson that no empire, no matter how glorious, can escape the judgment of truth. And so, the dark secrets of Ottoman victories are not just about what happened centuries ago. They are about the stories history tried to erase, the stories of women who lived, suffered, and endured in silence. To remember them is to finally give them the voice they were denied. Because empires fall, sultans die, monuments crumble. But the hidden pain of those left behind lingers across generations, whispering that victory is never as clean, never as noble, and never as glorious as the history books claim.